What if the Rolling Stones went new romantic? Join me in speculating wildly on this week's What If, How, When, Why. Hi there, my name's Morgan Brown, and every week I upload a new What If video to my YouTube channel. The idea of these videos is that each week I pick a different popular song and imagine an alternative universe in which a change of circumstances causes that song to come out completely different from the version that we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I have around the flat in order to bring that alternative version to life. So the song I picked this week was Start Me Up by the Rolling Stones, and I tried to convert that into a new romantic song. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster. So the Rolling Stones, obviously one of the most celebrated rock bands of all time, and rightly so. I'm a massive fan myself. They've had this huge 60-year career and counting, still absolutely packing them in today. Well, although they've been extremely successful for so long, I think it's probably fair to say that the vast majority of the songs that people really know, the ones that people tend to consider to be their classics, most of those come from that period from the mid-60s through to the early 70s, I guess, from around Aftermath through to, say, Exile on Main Street. With, obviously a scattering from after that, but definitely that's the period where most of the songs that people consider to be carved in stone classics come from. And while obviously in the last few decades they've definitely slowed down a lot, understandably, they're pretty advanced age now. It's amazing that they're still able to perform as they do. If you go back to like the 80s, they were still a really pretty prolific band, but that's an era of their music that doesn't seem to get talked about quite as much as their early material. Obviously, we're doing this track this week. It's an era I've been thinking about quite a lot, because Start Me Up is really probably the only song from that era that gets any kind of regular airplay or anything. So I was just kind of having a bit of a think about what was going on with the Stones during that decade, as they entered it kind of on a high, really. The late 70s had been a little bit uncertain for them, I think. The Mick Taylor era sort of tailed off with It's Only Rock and Roll to some extent, and then they moved on after Mick Taylor left in fairly uncertain fashion with Black and Blue, kind of just a bit of a scrappy record. But they ended the decade in fine style with Some Girls, which is an absolute classic. For me, it's probably like a top 3 Rolling Stones record. Roddy Wood properly in place as the new guitarist in the band, and there's just a renewed energy and attitude to them on that record. Finds them edging into some contemporary territory. There's hints of like punk attitude in there. There's a nod to disco on Miss You, but they're not trying to be something they're not. They might have these contemporary flavours in there, but everything still sounds really authentically like the Stones. Just a new, invigorated Stones, and it's an absolute cracker of a record. So they go into the 80s on a high from this, and the first album of the 1980s, Emotional Rescue, I mean, commercially was a massive success for them, and it's fine. In many respects, kind of continues where Some Girls was leading them. There's a few hints of slightly punky new wavy things going on in there. There's a little bit more disco. There's another attempt to delve into reggae, which I'm never too keen on the Stones playing reggae. It just doesn't seem to suit them at all. Always feels a bit clunky to me, but there's nothing wrong with it. The songs are fine. It just feels like a bit of a damp squib after Some Girls. And I think the reviews at the time reflected that feeling, although it sold a hell of a lot of copies. The critics tended to feel like, to some extent, the Stones were treading water a little bit. And I don't think that's unfair. Not to say it's a bad record, there's still some good stuff on there, but there's nothing that you'd put really in that kind of top tier of Stones songs. So to follow that up, they needed something pretty quick because they had a massive tour booked, needed to turn around another album, didn't really have much in the way of new songs in the bank. So Tattoo You is largely cobbled together from demos that they already had in the bank, kind of going back almost a decade. So some of the stuff is just reworked from things that they were doing way back when Mick Taylor was in the band. And that album was actually much more critically favoured than the previous one had been. Obviously features Start Me Up, which I think started out as another reggae track, but they reworked it into obviously a classic Stones rocker, and it's a more satisfying selection of songs, did really well, got good reviews, and obviously that must be good for the Stones, but at the same time, you've got to imagine it kind of stung a bit to have your album of new songs be given a bit of a critical cold shoulder, and then your album of old demos be given a much better reception. So at least in the back of their minds, they must have been feeling like, ooh, what are we going to do to show that we've still got it, that our new material is up to scratch? And I guess that leads them into the Undercover album, and that's a really interesting one. There's a distinct feeling of it pulling in a few different directions, because on the one hand, it's really striving to do something new, to connect with contemporary trends and show that the Stones haven't been left behind, that they're in touch with what's going on. So there's new wavy sounding stuff, there's funky stuff, there's some very 80s sounding musical textures on there. There's the dreaded Simmons drums crop up, which I'm sure sounded very modern at the time, but like everything else they were used on, they'd just timestamp it. All kinds of stuff going on, but at the same time, there's a bunch of the songs that are real kind of traditional Stones rock tracks too. And from what I can gather from reading around it, that was Mick and Keith pulling in different directions. Keith wanting to cling to the more traditional Stones sound, and Mick really striving to reach out and find new things to use to add to their arsenal. It's not bad by any means, there's definitely some cool stuff on there, but it's just a strange kind of schizophrenic album. And again, like Emotional Rescue, some decent stuff on there, but nothing that's really going to trouble your list of top Stones songs. And I think it was that album really that made me start thinking this week, with just a little bit more push, if the band had followed a bit more willingly along these lines of thinking that Mick was pursuing, who's to say maybe they could have tried doing something a bit more new romantic flavoured. I mean, certainly with their little forays into new wave, they weren't a million miles away. The new romantic movement's a funny one really, because there's not necessarily a definitive new romantic sound. I think that's probably because although it became a music movement, it really started as more of a fashion movement. And I'm certainly no fashion expert, so please forgive me if I get this wrong, but as I understand it, it really kind of grew out of punk. Punk fashion, certainly in the early days in London, is quite sort of art school influenced, experimental, quite flamboyant. And then as punk expanded and the second wave happens, you start getting more street level kind of punk. It moves out to the provinces. There's a bit more of a kind of orthodoxy of punk fashion starts to occur. There's a bit less kind of experimental fashion, a bit more denim and leather, and crass with the uniform kind of dyed black stuff. I think probably some of those people who had latched onto punk fashion in the early days felt like that was a bit of a betrayal of the original spirit, so they started to look for something that was going to be a little bit less austere, and that's where the new romantic thing starts happening. So it's combining that sort of provocation of early punk fashion with elements of glam, and also picking and choosing from a grab bag of different historical styles. So, bits of Regency dress, bits of kind of Louis XIV costumery, all kinds of elements of flamboyant historical fashion mixed in a kind of cut and paste fashion with elements of punk and glam. So the people following this fashion flock together, start gathering in these clubs, notably the Blitz Club. I guess the music that becomes associated with New Romantic comes out of these people gathering together, the music that they're listening to influencing the music that they create. I guess it's probably the soundtrack to those times would be a mixture of the artier end of punk and post-punk combined with bits of the artier end of glam, so Bowie and Roxy music kind of stuff, bits of funk and disco, kind of the sophisticated sound of people like Chic, and also some of the interesting experimental electronic stuff that's coming out of Germany. So Kraftwerk and Neu, the whole kind of krautrock scene, all of that's there in that melting pot. So eventually records start emerging with performers who are representatives to some extent of this new romantic style, but there are a few different sounds going on there. So for instance, I mean, a lot of people think of Adam and the Ants as one of the main new romantic acts, mainly because of that whole Prince Charming image and, you know, obviously the kind of punked up highwayman outfits with the wild hair and the face paint and everything. That's a definitive new romantic image, but then the music, mixture of post-punk with glitter band guitars and Burundi beats, isn't really the sound that I think of as sort of quintessentially new romantic. The bands that represent that best for me would be Duran Duran and Spandau Ballet, both of whom to different extents have that blend of some elements of post-punk, kind of punky energy with funk underpinning, some definite nods to different eras of Bowie, so there's some glam in there, but there's also quite a lot of the young Americans kind of soul boy feel, some of the thin white Duke coldness that again, that krautrock influence as well in the synthy kind of electronic aspects of the sounds. That sort of mixture of influences, those kind of bands particularly exemplify what I think of as a new romantic sound. To bring things back to this week's song, every week I come up with an alternative universe scenario to explain how the song has come into existence. So this week's scenario is just that in our alternative universe, it's 1980, late in the year, so the Stones have released Emotional Rescue. They've been really pleased with the success of it, but not been quite so happy with the reviews it's received. A few critics have accused them of treading water, just repeating themselves a little bit, and they're a bit worried about that. Starting to have a little bit of a crisis of confidence. They're thinking, are we so out of touch? Do we not know what's going on anymore? Are we just stuck in our ways? To try and drown their sorrows, Mick and Keith decide they're just going to go on a bit of a bender around London, a bit of a pub crawl, so they head out, spend a whole afternoon in various watering holes around London. By the evening, they find themselves in this club, walk through the doors of the club, and are immediately just astonished by the sight that they behold, because they're just all these young people in fashion like they've never seen before, just outrageous hairstyles, wild mixtures of different eras of fashion thrown together in exciting new combinations, androgynous makeup. They're just quite captivated by this sight. They get talking to some of the patrons and start hearing about New Romantic, and at the same time they're absorbing the music that's playing. As they're listening to this, they immediately sober up. They're looking at each other thinking, oh my god, this is it. This is where we need to go to bring the Stones back to relevance. So the next day they regroup back in the studio and explain to the other guys about this new movement they've discovered and how they think this is going to be the salvation of the Rolling Stones. So start off by listening back to some demos and finding some songs that I think will work in this style. One of which is Start Me Up, which, as I mentioned before at the time, is kind of a reggae flavoured song, but they strip all that away and rework it with chorus guitars and synths and Charlie doing his best to play something funky to underpin it. And they continue in that vein, finish up the album, then launch this new romantic version of the Rolling Stones on the world, bedecked in their finery, ruffled shirts and kilts and makeup and all of that. And a few critics are quite impressed with their bold attempt to reinvent themselves, but on the whole the reception's pretty frosty. The fans aren't loving it. They're wondering where the rock and roll's gone. So after a little while trying to convince people that this is the way, the Stones reluctantly acknowledge that perhaps they should have just stuck to the rock and roll and gradually back away from this, leaving behind just one album that's a bizarre outlier in their catalogue, where for a brief moment the Stones left the beaten track and just tried something fairly outrageous. So in order to create this outrageous New Romantic Stones, obviously my first step, as ever with these things, was just to take the isolated vocal, drop it into GarageBand and sync it up to the grid. I decided to speed it up a little bit. I mean, it's pretty up-tempo anyway, but I just wanted to give it a bit of a similar tempo to Rio by Duran Duran, which I guess is kind of the template I was working to, those old Duran Duran singles, because that for me is sort of the definitive New Romantic sound, really. Once I'd got the vocal in there and the tempo set, popped some drums on, went for 16ths on the hi-hat with a bit of a galloping kick drum pattern, and big snare sound with loads of gated reverb for that proper kind of big 80s pop feel. And then popped a bass line on. If you've been watching any more of these What If, How, and Why videos, you'll know I've been trying to improve my fingerstyle bass playing. I'm not really a bassist, I'm more of a guitarist, so thought this was a good opportunity to try that. So came up with a bass line that's like a bit more melodic in the verse, and then I've got a little bit of slapping and popping, quite simple slapping and popping because I'm not very good at it in the chorus, and thought that felt a little bit like a Neoromantic bass line. Some outrageous bass players in Neoromantic. If you listen to any of those, Duran Duran, Spandau Ballet, Kajagoogoo particularly, there are so many iconic bass lines, more so than guitar parts really. I wasn't going to be able to come up with anything like that, but I think what I did come up with works pretty well. Guitar-wise, kind of wanted to keep the signature guitar riff to start me up in there because that's one of the main hooks of the song, but just couldn't find a way to do it. I tried moving it into the keyboards, but it still didn't really work, so I had to just jettison that completely. Listening to Duran Duran, one of the things that I noticed is quite often the guitar is just doing something melodic rather than being particularly chordal, so quite often it's just sort of single note lines. So I thought I'd try and come up with something like that. So over on one side of the stereo, we've got an overdriven guitar with quite a lot of chorus on, just playing a repeated melodic thing. And then because obviously the Stones have got two guitarists, I needed a second guitar part. So the other one is doing something more chordal, but with a much cleaner sound, with loads of flanging on, just for, again, that sort of glossy 80s-ness. Then I figured we needed some keyboards on, so there are a couple of different things happening keyboard-wise. There's a little melody which you hear first over the intro, and then it comes back in as we build the song back up as it goes along. And then in the meantime, we've got an arpeggiator as well, because that's just a really great 80s sound, just having that bubbling away in the background too. And there's not really that much else on there. When I first started thinking about Neoromantic and thinking about some of those classic songs, in my mind, because they sound really big and dramatic, I kind of assumed that there were loads and loads of layers of stuff on there. But actually, if you listen to something like Rio by Duran Duran, that is just a 5-piece band. There's one guitar, one keyboard. There's not loads of layers of overdubs. It's just, I think that the sounds that are on there are big sounds, so the whole thing sounds big. So I didn't want to overdo it. I added some hand claps later on just to bolster the rhythm a bit, but otherwise it's those elements. We drop some bits out and then kind of build up the layers as it goes on to just let it gather some momentum. And then for a video, kept it pretty simple this time. Mostly it's just some performance footage for which I used, it's the concert that they released as Let's Spend the Night Together, so contemporary to the era that I'm working on. It's not an era where there's loads of camcorder footage of them that I could use that wouldn't be copyrighted, so had to do that. And then I've just interspersed that with some cool footage of actual Neoromantic kids back in the early 80s, just milling about, socialising, enjoying wearing their outrageous fashions and having a dance. So that's just blended in there to give it a bit more of a kind of atmosphere of the scene that we're representing there. So I hope you enjoyed it. I had loads of fun making it. It was great fun investigating the building blocks of what I considered to be the Neoromantic sound. And it was good fun going back and re-listening to some of those early 80s Stones albums as well, because I haven't done that for a while. But yeah, let me know what you think. And if you did enjoy it, please like and subscribe. I always really appreciate that. If there's anything else you'd like me to do in coming weeks, any genres you'd like me to take a swing at, any artists you'd like me to investigate, or any songs you'd like me to have a go at, please do let me know. I always appreciate your suggestions too. But otherwise, that's all from me for this week. So thanks very much indeed for watching, and I'll see you next time.